winter's chill seeped through the tattered tents, penetrating to the bone even those huddled 3 deep in rough woolen clothing. The wounded were numerous, not just from sword or spear. Frost, hunger, and disease reaped a harvest no less deadly than the enemy. Marcus, a veteran of 3 campaigns, shivered, trying to warm his frozen hands by pressing them to his chest beneath his coarse cloak. He remembered the sun of Dalmatia, the taste of grapes, and the laughter of his friends before their cohort found themselves here, in this desolate, snow-covered wasteland at the Empire's edge. Now, few of his friends remained, and each neighbor's glance seemed to ask, how much longer? He recalled tales of legionaries from bygone eras, their might, their conquest of lands and subjugation of peoples. Now they were exhausted, despondent, forgotten by the empire they had served faithfully. Their supplies were delayed, and the promised rewards for their service dwindled with each passing day. The bread they received was stale and moldy, the meat tough and acridly pungent. The water was a murky, swamp-like color and taste. It seemed even Mars himself had turned his back on them. One evening, as darkness enveloped the camp, a clamor erupted. Some legionaries, driven to desperation by hunger and cold, began to shout rebelliously, demanding answers from the centurion. Old Centurion Gaius, a man whose face was etched with the ravages of war and time, tried to pacify them, but his words were drowned out by the wave of outrage. He spoke of supply problems, transport delays, and the difficulties on the roads blocked by snowdrifts. Yet his words convinced no one. Tension reached a breaking point. Some began to throw stones at the centurion's tents. Others cursed and threatened. Marcus, though angry himself, saw the futility of it. Rebellion against their own army was suicide. He knew the empire wouldn't forget them, but waiting was the only option. So he tried to diffuse the situation, saying in a calm voice, "Brothers, we've endured so much. What's another week? Let's persevere. If help doesn't arrive after that, then we'll talk." To his surprise, his words had an effect. The legionaries, physically and morally exhausted, gradually calmed down and fell silent. However, hope for swift relief dwindled with the melting snow. A few days later, another legionary died. He was buried in the frozen earth without prayer or proper honors. His body, enveloped in a white shroud of snow, disappeared into the white expanse as if he had never existed. Marcus placed a small flower he found under a tent on his grave, mindful that he himself might be next. He, like the others, understood that this war was no longer for Rome, but for survival. One morning, however, through the mist, familiar standards appeared. It was a supply convoy. The sounds of trumpets and cries of joy echoed through the camp. It seemed the sun itself broke through the clouds, enveloping the legionaries in warmth and hope. Hunger and cold receded, though the memories of those arduous days of loss and suffering remained with them forever, a testament to their endurance and unbreakable spirit even in the most difficult circumstances. Hopes for the future and a return home burned brighter than ever before. The winter wind howled, penetrating to the bone even through the thick woolen cloaks. The camp, once noisy with clamor and shouting, was now steeped in silence, broken only by the creak of wooden structures and the coughs of the sick. Those who survived the Battle of the Upper Danube bore little resemblance to the invincible legionaries they once were. Dirty, exhausted, their faces lined with fatigue and pain, they gathered around meager fires, trying to warm themselves and forget the horrors they had endured. Marcus, a veteran of 3 campaigns, clutched his battered shield to his chest, the sole reminder of his former glory. He watched his comrades, young, inexperienced legionaries, whose eyes expressed not so much fear as profound despair. Most of them had seen real war for the first time, and it had crushed them like fragile clay. It wasn't what the recruiters in Rome had promised, not heroic battles on well-prepared fields, but a dirty, exhausting struggle for survival in cold, swampy forests against an enemy who preferred guerrilla warfare to open combat. The Dacians, it seemed, melted into the forest, appearing unexpectedly, striking and disappearing without a trace. Their arrows, loosed from cover, found many targets. The legionaries, accustomed to discipline and formation, were powerless against this cunning foe. Marcus remembered the death of Lucius, a young legionary from his centuria. He died not in battle, but from disease, dysentery, which mowed down the ranks like a scythe. The doctors, or rather those who considered themselves such, could only helplessly shrug their shoulders. Herbs and bandages, that was the extent of their medicine. Lucius was buried under the frozen ground, without honors, without an epitaph. Just another unnoticed death among thousands. Marcus knew that Lucius's death was only one of many sacrifices of this senseless war. He felt a sharp pain in his chest, a scar from a Dacian arrow that had grazed him during the last raid. The wound had healed, but it ached with every movement. He felt fatigue filling his body with a leaden weight, but Marcus knew he couldn't afford to give in. He had to survive for himself, for those still alive. He had to return home, to his family, to warmth, to peace. He approached the fire, adding a few more branches to the flames. The flames leapt up, casting flickering light on the faces of his comrades. They sat like stone statues, wrapped in their cloaks, with dull gazes fixed on the endless darkness of the night wilderness. But somewhere deep within their hearts, a spark of hope flickered, hope to return home, hope for life, hope that kept them afloat amidst despair and pain, hope that was the only lifeline in this bottomless, eternal sea of war. Hope that someday, somehow, this terrible winter would end, and the sun would once again warm their frozen souls. For now, all that remained was to wait, to survive, and to pray to the gods. The winter storm raged with merciless fury, blanketing the tented settlement of Roman legionaries stranded in the Carpathian Mountains. The expected easy victory over the local tribes had turned into a grueling war of survival. Dozens of legionaries, once well-trained and invincible, lay in the cold earth, consumed by the relentless frost and an unknown disease that spread through the camp with unstoppable speed. This was no ordinary cold. It was something more insidious, a fever that broke the body, drove men mad, and left behind only empty eyes and soldiers exhausted to death. Marcus, centurion of the 3rd cohort, watched his men with a heavy heart. His own strength and courage, once unwavering, began to falter under the weight of circumstances. He had already lost 2 of his best legionaries, strong, hardy men he had known since childhood. Now, standing on the brink of the abyss, he understood that Roman might was not invincible. The Carpathians, with their impassable forests and treacherous mountains, proved to be a worthy adversary, surpassing even the best-prepared warriors. A physician arrived at the camp, a thin man with sad eyes who had seen many deaths. He brought with him a small amount of medicine that could barely alleviate the pain and slowly suppress the symptoms of the disease. Marcus, understanding the doctor's helplessness, ordered the implementation of strict hygiene rules to prevent the further spread of the disease. On his orders, the remains of the dead were burned, and the living legionaries were placed farther apart, creating makeshift quarantine zones. In addition to the disease, food supplies were dwindling. The long and harsh winter depleted the already meager reserves. The legionaries, weakened by illness and hunger, became increasingly irritable and resentful. Marcus understood that without a quick solution to the problem, a rebellion might erupt. He gathered his officers and devised a plan of action.
They decided to send a small reconnaissance detachment to the nearest settlement to establish contact with the locals and obtain provisions. The risk was enormous. The inhabitants of the Carpathians were warlike, and a meeting with them could end in tragedy. But Marcus saw no other way out. He chose the most experienced and healthiest legionaries for this dangerous mission. The warriors' hearts were gripped by fear and a desperate desire to survive. They were exhausted, but their will to live, fueled by mortal danger, was unbroken. The scouts set out into a night filled with dangers. Their path lay through dense snow-covered forests, where every step could be their last. They moved silently like ghosts, hoping not to encounter anyone along the way. Finally, after several hours,